Honorable guests, dear virtual audience, dear limited audience in the room here, very welcome to this special Ambassador's Lecture. The fourth wave of the COVID pandemic is hitting our country particularly hard. Our university was forced to activate yet another special regime last week. We then decided to prioritize the continuity of our teaching and research, including the possibility for our students to attend classes on campus. At the same time, we have to be stricter with regard to the organization of our events, such as this Ambassador's Lecture, which was initially going to be organized in a hybrid format, but is now largely taking place online. The introduction to this event has also been affected by the pandemic. Normally, our Vice Rector, Peter Leuven, Vice Rector responsible for international affairs, would have been here introducing this event, but he is currently in quarantine, safe and sound, so no worries. So I'm doing what can be expected of a rector, filling in the gaps. With the program of today, the organizers have a double ambition. We will start with short introductions of recent initiatives to bring different actors of our KU Leuven community, all sharing interests and ties with North America, together. Building a more visible transatlantic community is one of the goals of our Regional Committee for North America. The chair of this committee, Professor Leen Danens of the Institute for Media Studies, will introduce you to their activities. Then, another recent initiative will be introduced by Ambassador Dirk Wouters, former Belgian ambassador in the US, among many other posts. Ambassador Wouters, together with a group of very engaged US experts, established the America-Europe Fund, aiming at support for intense interactions between KU Leuven and the US, both in education and research. One of the first initiatives this fund is supporting is the brand new module on comparative American-European studies embedded within our Master of European Studies. And that program, that new module, will be introduced by the program director, Professor Keukeleire of the Leuven International and European Studies Institute of the Faculty of Social Sciences. These three relatively short introductions will set a scene for our two esteemed guests. Professor Pippa Norris, John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, who is joining us from across the Atlantic, will present a lecture on two phases of trust, evidence in a transatlantic context. I'm very much looking forward to learning about the perspectives of Professor Norris on this topic, which is extremely relevant for our society in these complex times. I'm also very pleased that Mr. Berliner, Chargé d'Affaires of the US Embassy in Belgium, has accepted to add his remarks, elaborating on the transatlantic partnership that is based on trust and shared values. Being able to rely on trust and values is indeed of utmost importance to build strong and lasting relationships. Also, as a university, we are relying on networks and collaborations with academic institutions, more than 20 in the US, but of course from all over the world. In our collaborations, KU Leuven stresses the importance of values. When setting up new partnerships, we openly communicate about our values, as included in our mission statement. Values in international partnerships refer to balance and reciprocity, shared goals and ambitions, respect for human rights, as supported by relevant international agreements and treaties, and we are very explicit about our high ethical standards in terms of research and research integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very busy evening session ahead of us with esteemed speakers on interesting and very actual topics. So let's move on with the program. I pass the floor to Professor Leen Danes, Chair of the Regional Committee for North America. Leen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Rector. A very warm welcome to this inaugural event of KU Leuven's Regional Committee North America. KU Leuven's international policy focuses, among other instruments, on regional committees that look for opportunities for academic collaboration in specific regions. Seeking to bring big politics together with university cooperation here at KU Leuven, a new president in the US and a new term for Canada's Prime Minister seem to be fertile ground for further academic transatlantic cooperation, honoring common values and principles such as academic freedom, gender equality, integrity, diversity, and open science to allow for an effective and trusted cooperation between partners. The North America Regional Committee is one of 6 regional committees that have been established quite recently. And the Regional Committee consists of researchers from the university's 3 disciplinary groups: the humanities, represented by Professor Pieter Vermeulen, science and technology, represented by Professor Marjan van Helst, and biomedical sciences by Professor Liz Jones, and staff also, with an affinity for the region, in our case, the US and Canada. We also have in our midst the former ambassador of Belgium to the US, Dirk Wouters, to help us build that transatlantic community here at KU Leuven. The staff of the International Office represent KU Leuven at study and go abroad fairs and put us in touch with the Amici Louvaniensis and our alumni chapter in the US. There are, of course, plenty of reasons why one might consider studying in the US. Because of the country's world-class universities, a wide variety of flexible study programs, the large cultural diversity and tolerance within college campuses, and the many resources that making studying in the US for international students as easy as possible. The benefits for international students studying in Canada are also numerous. Whether one chooses to study in one of the country's large cities or settle on a smaller campus, it will provide a unique experience that will last for a lifetime. KU Leuven has ties with North American universities, either through bilateral contracts or through membership in a global network of leading research universities. We seek, of course, also to be as attractive as possible to students from the US and Canada. And therefore, we have set up a comprehensive, ready-made offer of about 70 mainly short mobility periods or research internships that we want to present to our existing partners and selected universities in the coming weeks or months. In the context of the new global exchange program, it is crucial to keep the balance between incoming and outgoing students. As a parallel track to this, the North America Regional Committee has initiated the development of an exclusive program offering research internship to students from top universities in the US and Canada. And we started with a pilot, with a view to starting in the summer of 2022. We are offering research internships at KU Leuven to which interested students at Harvard University, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and Columbia University in the US, and University of Toronto and Université de Montréal in Canada are invited. With this pilot, we are primarily targeting international students at the senior bachelor and master's level in these priority North American selected partner universities. We're open to short research internships and thesis projects. The modalities of the project can be flexibly determined. The supervisors commit themselves to supervision during the project. They may expect high-quality international interaction and networking with North American partner institutions, possibly also interested in joining a Horizon Europe program as an associated partner. The research in cooperation with an excellent partner institution will certainly increase also the visibility of the research. While this event has just started and had to go online due to the raging pandemic, we are already forging plans for our second event in the spring of 2022. This will be an information session on funding opportunities for joint transatlantic research and research mobility. Here we will be looking at how the Fund for Scientific Research, the Fulbright Commission, the Belgian American Educational Foundation, and our own KU Leuven Research Coordination Office can contribute to this. Our plan is also to present in the spring of 2022, through poster sessions, joint scientific research at KU Leuven with North American partners, to make visible results of the cooperation between members of that transatlantic intellectual community, and to inspire and encourage new members of this community to apply. The intention of the North America Regional Committee is to share research results, successes, challenges, and help circumvent potential obstacles. And I now would like to call your attention to Mr. Dirk Wouters, former ambassador of Belgium to the US and EU, co-chair of the America-Europe Fund and also co-organizer of this event.
Hi, everybody. I'm probably the first to really regret that we cannot personally, here in this beautiful promotion hall or at the concluding reception. Because as already said, one of the main objectives of today's event was to help create a renewed transatlantic community here at KU Leuven and do some networking. So I feel I should start by saying that we owe you all a drink, a beer, and we will keep our promise. For my presentation, I will use a couple of slides, make a few substantive remarks, and if I can ask maybe the first or the second slide, so the next slide, the thrust of my remarks you can follow on the two slides now. So, and let me start by saying that now more than ever, we are grateful. We are grateful that so many European and North American students, academics, universities, diplomats and business leaders have supported the transatlantic community throughout the years. At a time when everything seems uncertain, we find really comfort and encouragement knowing that people still care about this transatlantic space and about some strategic interests in that space. Times may be uncertain, even very uncertain, but they also coincide with unprecedented opportunities in transatlantic interests, both geopolitical, technological, on innovation, ecological, business strategic, and also scientific. So I think we are, and this is my first substantive remark, we are at a unique moment for the transatlantic community, and let's hope that a moment becomes a momentum, and a momentum can be translated into concrete projects and programs. It was in October 2020, while much of the world already had stopped, that we were able to set up the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. And we remain proud of this initiative. Why this initiative? Well, there are several reasons. The first has to do with differences and alikeness between Europe and the United States. Those familiar with these two continents, they will probably agree with me that differences between Europe and America are perhaps less outspoken than those, for example, among the 27 member states of the EU or among the 50 states themselves in the United States. And yet, in recent years, we seem to be focusing almost exclusively on the gap between us. So the statement, the Atlantic gets wider, is therefore somehow correct, as is the statement, I think, which I love to add, that too often we tend to be a bit narcissistic about differences that really are minor. And then there is public opinion. Public opinion in Europe. We all know that European citizens rejoiced after President Biden's electoral victory. That's the public opinion here in Europe. But public opinion also is not sure that America can come back as a global leader or continue to remain a strategic security provider. Large numbers of public opinion in Europe think that US politics is broken. These are strong words, but this is a reflection, I think, of public opinion, that we cannot be sure that another President Trump is elected, and that internal divisions and the focus on this very important domestic agenda in the United States will prevent real engagement on international issues such as climate change, China, European security, Middle East, etc. Furthermore, and this is my next remark, majorities in Europe think that China will become a stronger power than the United States in the next 10 years, but they fail also themselves in Europe to factor in and deal adequately, I think, with Europe's own weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Of course, public opinion is volatile, and there is the unfortunate tendency in Europe to see the United States, this fascinating continent, almost exclusively through the eyes of the one person occupying the White House. So starting from all these assumptions, and also a bit based on my personal experience at the European Union and in Washington, the overall aim of the America-Europe Fund became to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of and stronger mutual relations between the US and the EU, including Belgium. To this end, the fund promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs and research at KU Leuven aimed at strengthening this comparative knowledge of American and European societies. The fund also initiates cooperation and exchanges between the US, the EU, Belgium and Flanders in the fields of education, science, business, culture, diplomacy and policy making. A slogan we often use in our communication of the fund is that together, Europe and America can be a formidable force for the good. Unfortunately, for too long, I think, the US and Europe have been analyzed in rather separate silos with little comparative perspective. It's about time, I think, that we start to see the benefits to be gained from a comparison between the European and American systems in as many domains as possible. In its own way, the America-Europe Fund supports the clear strategic choice and the substantially increased internationalization ambitions of KU Leuven vis-à-vis North America, by encouraging exchanges of students, researchers, professors and experts, in addition to the existing scholarship mechanisms and cooperation agreements at all levels. With the fund, we want to be part of this collective effort at KU Leuven. If you can show the second slide, please. Thank you. So what does the fund do? There are three strands of work today. First, the fund provides a transatlantic academic platform. We offer students more teaching, research, knowledge, and insights on comparing the US and Europe, and not only from the Belgian or European side. And that's why we were so happy with the first realization of the fund in December 2020. We received official approval for this new teaching model that was already mentioned within the Master of European Studies at KU Leuven. Professor Stefan Keukelere will speak about this Master Studies and this model, Comparative American European Studies. Our biennial prize for the best comparative American European master thesis is also in line with this. Furthermore, our range of transatlantic lectures, debates, and other events which can be found on our website, which you can find on the slide as well, are of interest to a wider audience. We also like to bring European and American policymakers to KU Leuven. And the recent meeting lecture with Margaret Vestager, the Vice President of the European Commission, on November 12th, was, I think, a good illustration, not least for the almost 2,000 strong audience. Second strand of work, more transatlantic research. We are supporting with a fund, I think, an important project on the history of scientific cooperation between Belgium and the United States. And soon we will start the academic chair at this university on innovation, technology, and international regulation. And then there's the last strand of work, which has to do with the fact that we reached out to a selected number of Belgian business leaders with a large transatlantic experience and who can contribute to the success, we hoped, of our mission. And so in sync with the academic platform and our long-term academic vision, and closely, hopefully, to the soon emerging transatlantic community at KU Leuven, the management of the America-Europe Fund has created a transatlantic business platform. The idea is to have high-level strategic discussions once or twice a year in a core group of very well-informed leading actors, developing new networks at KU Leuven and across the Atlantic involving leading universities, promoting specific research or events that are strategic. These are just a few examples of things that might be of interest to those business leaders. In 2 weeks' time, we are holding online, unfortunately, such a high-level stakeholder forum and discuss the current transatlantic economic, innovation, and technology agenda. Further steps, and I will conclude, I think we want to, and we need to develop a stronger footprint in the US, both for the development of the master program, by selecting, hopefully, an American sister university, but also by looking for sister organizations who would like to share and spread our mission. I continue to believe that also in America there is an intellectual hunger for Europe that persists, often based on history, of course, in which the Americans twice liberated our continent in the past century, but also American business leaders and academics clearly, I think, want to continue to interact with the European field. We will continue to develop partner agreements like we did with the German Marshall Fund, which seems logical, and also the Belgian American Educational Foundation. And then, last but not least, we would like to launch very soon a chapter for young persons within the fund. So here is my appeal for support to the audience. Please know that, of course, you're all important to us. It's only with your support and the support of our stakeholders that we will be able to face the challenges of our mission and bring our initiatives and innovative ideas to a good end. So we're asking you, please join us in our new programs, transatlantic lectures, high-level events, and further steps. And please share with us also your ideas, your suggestions on how to give further life and expand our transatlantic academic and other platforms. In particular, I'm thinking also on this young persons chapter of the fund, and I hope you will all help us to build a wider community of friends of the America-Europe Fund and of all the North America activities here at KU Leuven. Thank you very much. And now I pass it on to Professor Stefan Keukelere.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Waters. As the Director of the Master of European Studies, Transnational and Global Perspectives, I'm very pleased to introduce to you one of the first tangible results of the fund. And that is the creation of the new Comparative American European Studies module in the framework of the Masters of European Studies. The Masters of European Studies is one of the oldest European Studies programs in Europe, already created 35 years ago, more or less. It's interdisciplinary. It has a very international audience with with students from more than 30 nationalities. And important is its focus on the external relations and external context of the EU, of Europe, with other continents. And interestingly, we had modules on the EU's relations with the southern neighborhood, with the Mediterranean, with Eastern Europe, with Asia, but not yet with the United States. So this transatlantic dimension, which is always included in many of our courses, was not part of one of the specific modules. And in this sense, I'm very grateful to the fund that the American Europe Fund was able and allowed us to create this specialized module on American-European relations. And as also the ambassador indicated, important is this comparative perspective. Important is that we see what the differences, but also similarities in the United States and in Europe are. And in this new module, we have 5 to 6 new courses and some old courses, and a very important course is the course provided and taught by Ambassador Waters himself on EU-United States diplomatic relations, but we have also courses provided and taught by all the colleagues from the fund, and I see here in the audience Professor Kermans, Professor Waters, there's also Professor Rauber, and they're providing courses on comparative transatlantic governance, quite important, I think, a specialized course on human rights and rule of law, which is a major challenge, not only in the Western external relations towards the rest of the world, but also a major challenge within Europe and within the United States. So I'm very pleased that it's also a specific course. There are courses on American politics, on American literature, and also on global law. And there we look at the impacts and the diversities in European and American perspectives. And we are very pleased that already at the very start of this new module 2 months ago, that we already have a very nice group of students who combine the American-Europe module together with other specialized modules, like the module on sustainability, the module on European external relations, on European diversity and history. And in this sense, the program allows students who focus on these transatlantic relations also to look at other specializations so that they have a dual background when following our master program. So, first of all, I'm very grateful, and I want to repeat this to all the members of the fund to allow us to create this new module. And secondly, to conclude, I obviously hope that next year we will have even more American students and European students. American students coming to Europe, indeed to get to learn these transatlantic relations much better, but also European students who would like to focus on this transatlantic dimension. And obviously, I also hope that we have non-Western students from outside Europe and outside the United States who come to Leuven to get to know, indeed, these transatlantic relations, which remain very important, I think, also for the future of the rest of Europe, of the United States, but also for the rest of the world. Thank you very much. I hope that I will meet some of you live in the reception that was promised by Ambassador Waters. And I'm giving the floor to my colleague, Professor Downs, to introduce Professor Pippa Norris and her speech in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in turbulent times. Listening to music, audio, books, or podcasts while walking has become a favorite and calming activity of me, and perhaps for some of you as well. And while preparing for this short introduction to Professor Pippa Norris' talk on the 2 faces of trust, I was reminded of a podcast by Stephen Fry, in his incomparable language, in which he complains about the many podcasts, mainly from the US, according to him, that deal with the so-called cultural wars between the powerful battalion of populist right, or alt-right, on the one hand, and the internationalists, the globalists, and their politically correct ideas for social justice on the other. Fry talks about, and I quote him, a seismic crack that grows wider every day, or the Grand Canyon in public discourse and political debate, especially in the West. He then wonders where he might position himself. He sees himself like millions of people who cannot find a place on one side or the other, and I quote him, cowering in the ravine below. And as a communication scholar, I wonder where the journalist should be positioned. Probably in the ravine with the goal of closing the gap between the two sides. What is needed is a journalism where the journalist acts as a mediator between various, possibly conflicting contents. This is especially important for the mainstream media, because they have the greatest potential to reach the audience. A great need and demand for independent journalism was demonstrated during the pandemic. When journalists and media experts are polled and asked what they think is the biggest challenge or the biggest question for the media industry, they wonder how to deal with the increase in misinformation and disinformation. What will be the influence of big tech in the playing field and in public discourse? So a very important question for our theme today is journalism succeeding in gaining and maintaining trust now that an as yet small group in Western Europe, but already a much larger group in North America, distrusts legacy media, and their distrust is becoming more vocal. Some 2 weeks ago, a scenario study was presented in The Hague on journalism in 2035. That was the horizon, 2035. It was a study commissioned by the Dutch Journalism Fund. And you know, a scenario study is not exactly exact science, but at least it gives us an idea of what the prospects might be of possible, plausible, radical scenarios. So we were presented with two axes. A vertical axis was presented around tech companies and data that may or may not be effectively regulated, and a horizontal axis around trust. Trust between citizens within society or mutual distrust. With then the four quadrants of radical, plausible scenarios proposed around it. Extremes, bubbles, money, and careful. So in the extreme scenario with the motto, you're either with us or against us, extreme voices dominate the debate, and there is a fragmented media landscape with no place for the mainstream media, and with increasing power for the tech companies. In the bubbles scenario, under the motto, a common danger unites even the bitterest enemies, there's a little bit of agreement. There's little inclusiveness. But groups live alongside each other in separate spheres. In the money scenario, under the motto, money makes the world go round, governments see no reason to crack down on big tech companies. There is a multi-voiced media landscape, but it's dominated by commercial logic. The big question here is how the public interest can be part of the media logic, and which information media manage to differentiate themselves. And finally, in the careful scenario, there's a resilient society, political stability. There's tech companies that are broken up. There's a solid mainstream news media landscape at work. And public broadcasting, with its commitment to internal diversity, provides a real counterweight in the commercial media landscape. This is a scenario that is almost too good to be true. But how now can we link a strategic transatlantic mission to this? A key question here is how can Europe and the US work together to tackle dis and misinformation, along with the big tech companies? In doing so, we need to recognize the importance of low-threshold mainstream news media. After all, they appeal to the less engaged news users and also have the greatest potential to reach the non-news users with internally diverse content and to successfully inform them about politics. After these four, or should I maybe say three, to varying degrees, disturbing scenarios, disturbing images of the future of journalism, it is now time to introduce to you, to all of us, the world-renowned political scientist, Professor Pippa Norris, to shine her light on the two sides of public trust. Is there too much distrust, or is there just too much trust? And if so, in which sources? Professor Dr. Pippa Norris is a comparative political scientist who has taught at Harvard University for 3 decades. She's the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government and the founding director of the Electoral Integrity Project, director of the Global Party Survey, co-director of the TrustGov project, and is executive board member of the World Values Survey. In her research, Professor Norris compares public opinion and elections, political institutions and cultures, gender politics and political communications in many countries worldwide. She received major career honors for her academic leadership, including the Samuel Eldersveld Lifetime Career Achievement Award, and received honorary doctorates from Edinburgh, Bergen, Leuven, and Warwick universities, amongst others. She was also a guest professor in many more universities around the world. She has published over 50 books, many translated into dozens of languages. 2 of her recent books focused on cultural backlash, Trump, Brexit, and authoritarian populism in 2019, published with Cambridge University Press with co-author Ronald Inglehart, and Electoral Integrity in America, published with Oxford University Press in 2018. Forthcoming books are under development on authoritarian legitimacy and in praise of skepticism. Trust, but verify. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to Professor Pippa Norris.
So much, Lene. It's a pleasure to be with everybody in Leuven. I wish I could be with you, but with the COVID situation, it makes everything difficult. And I would like to thank the Regional Committee of North America and the American Europe Fund of Leuven also for the invitation. So what I'd like to talk about today is to rethink some of our ideas about trust in transatlantic context, and think about in particular whether a lot of the literature that we've had in many decades being concerned about a decline of trust is actually framing the problem in the right way. So what I'm going to do is to think about some of these issues and give you a little bit, a smidgen of some of my report, my new book, which is coming out with Oxford University Press next year. So first, I'll set out the theoretical framework. What do we mean by trust and trustworthiness? And in particular, emphasize that it's the latter which we should really think about. I'll talk about the research design and data very briefly, and give a call out in particular to the World Values Study and the European Values Survey, both of which have provided an immense amount of data on these issues, going right back to 1981 and the most recent wave. I'll talk about the results and briefly summarize the analysis and the conclusions. So this is the book, and it's going to come out with Oxford University Press. And I'll talk in particular a little bit from the beginning chapters on the 2 faces of trust, what do I mean by that, and the general theory, and then skip into some of the evidence and the conclusions. So trust can be thought of in terms of 3 different levels. The work of the transatlantic community is very much concerned about global trust, the way in which we trust global institutions like the United Nations, regional associations, obviously like the European Union, and it's been the focus of international relations, cultural sociology, comparative politics for many decades. So clearly with the election in 2016 of Donald Trump, revived interest in whether there is a strong transatlantic community, including support for NATO in both partners. But also we can think about trust in terms of governance and national government. And that again has been the subject of many, many studies, and how far there is a trust in the Belgian government or the French government or the British government, and of course, trust under Trump in the United States. And that's been the focus of work in political behavior and comparative politics. And then lastly, of course, there's an immense literature on social, generalized or interpersonal trust, trust between people in the local community. That's been the work of sociologists, social psychologists, behavioral economics, and so on. So what's the work which has been done, and what's the conventional view? I think if we look back in recent decades, what we can see is that trust is claimed by most scholars and in the wider community as well to be absolutely critical. So trust amongst countries, it's argued, is really important for our forms of cooperation, the institutions which bind us together between North America and Western Europe in particular, or the European Union and the United States. And think about all the consequences which trust is thought to bring, which are thought to be beneficial. So, for example, the work of Bob Putnam, my colleague at the Kennedy School, is thought to have trust as the basis of societal cooperation. We have problems in our local community. How can we work together if we don't trust each other? If there's more divisions in societies, if people are intolerant of different groups, how can we ever hope to work? It's also thought by social psychologists to be important for even basic things like love and marriage. Again, trust between individuals is thought to sustain long-term relationships. Francis Fukuyama has argued it lubricates markets in the economy. And again, here the argument is that particularly if the law doesn't work for social contracts, but companies trust each other and consumers trust corporations, then this should lubricate the effectiveness of trade and cooperation at that level. Those in organizational psychology and sociology argue trust is critical for managing organizations, for example, between those who are employed and those who are managing or owning corporations. It's thought to be critical for political legitimacy, the work, for example, of Gamson, and indeed to underpin the rule of law. Because again, we need trust in the courts. We need trust in the system of justice to feel that the law should work and we should obey the law. In DC, a tremendous amount of work on how we should trust politicians and political institutions. And if we don't, and particularly if politicians in the Democratic and Republican Party have seen such a loss of trust, then this causes gridlock. How do we overcome that? And of course, for the international peace, there's an argument that if countries trust each other more, that's the basis of how we can have a lack of conflict and we can avoid international wars. So for all these reasons, we assume, everybody assumes, that low or declining signs of trust are a problem. So what we can do is think this through and ask ourselves, is there good evidence? Well, certainly we've documented public trust in government, and this is a familiar chart. And what this argues, and this is from the Pew Center on Research, an excellent source for this, they've compiled many different surveys which go back to the 1960s, the earliest work which we've documented, and go through to more recent years. And you can immediately see that trust in the United States government is low. This is the question: Americans, can you trust a government in Washington to do the right thing just about always or most of the time? And you can see from the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations, where there was over 70%, 80% said yes, they trust government. We can see the immense decline throughout the more divided period of hot button politics of the 1960s and 70s, through to the 1980s and the election of Reagan, stays kind of flat, goes down again under Bush and Clinton, revives a little bit, but then goes down again. So the contrast between the beginning and the end looks really problematic. And let's update that. Here's some evidence from the Pew Research Center on the most recent global survey, which they did in 2020. What does it look like in comparative perspective? And if we look, for example, at the percentage who say they're satisfied with the way democracy is working in their country, not the same as trust, but nevertheless closely related, we can see that in Germany, high support. In United Kingdom, slightly less, but still the majority trust government. France, the same. The United States, no. Here we can see that if you add up those who say not at all or not too much, we see a majority who say they don't trust the way democracy is working. More of an indication of a crisis of legitimacy in the political system. And if we look at the second part there with the satisfaction with democracy over time, from 2017 to 2020, just the recent period, again, it does go down a bit in 2018, 2019 in Germany. And that's partly related, I think, to the refugee crisis and other economic issues associated, but it goes back up again. And we can see a similar pattern in France and in the United Kingdom. We had obviously a decline of trust associated with Brexit, But again, trust went back, partly associated with the pandemic and the fact that people felt that we had to rally around the government. But in the United States, it went down and has not recovered, even in recent years with the election of Joe Biden in 2020. Again, I don't need to tell you all about the crisis of January the 6th in the United States, an insurrection, an armed insurrection arriving in deaths and fatalities, arriving in a tremendous challenge to the legitimacy of American government, and one where in the initial aftermath, politicians on both sides of the aisle were in agreement about the crisis. Mitch McConnell, for example, came to the Senate and said, yes, this is a fundamental problem. This can't continue. But in recent months and in the most recent polls, in fact, there's been a tremendous divide between Republicans and Democrats, with Democrats pursuing an investigation into the causes of the insurrection, but the Republicans refusing to participate, except for a couple of honorable exceptions. But nevertheless, public opinion has divided even further. And again, in America, we thought that with the election and with the inauguration of Biden, that these concerns would gradually fade. But no, instead of which the divide has got deeper, both in state houses, in the actions which are being taken over the electoral system through changing the electoral laws, and through divisions in Congress, even on matters that you might have thought would have brought both parties together, like infrastructure. So what we can see is that there are real problems, and this has led to the challenges which are there. I'm sorry, the slide just slid over. This is the most recent poll in America in the Economist YouGov poll. And again, as you can see, it's the last few days. And the question of, did Biden legitimately win? And you can look at the results, and of course, amongst Democrats, yes. But overall in the population, 4 out of 10 Americans said no, Biden did not legitimately win. And as you can see, it's concentrated heavily amongst those who support Trump, where 3/4 say no. So how do we explain what's going on here? There's an extensive literature, which I won't go into in depth because it's familiar, I'm sure, to many of our audience and most scholars around the world, whether it's work on bowling alone, whether it's work on trust by Fukuyama, newer work on the foundations of trust, which are done by by many colleagues, including Margaret Levy. And all of these have argued that there's a positive value for social or interpersonal trust for many reasons, including those which I've already alluded to. That social trust between individuals allows us to work together, intolerance pulls us apart. And of course, we also have work on the decline of political trust, which goes right back to the crisis of democracy literature, excuse me, by the Trilateral Commission in the early 70s, work by Sam Huntington and others, and more recent work, which is by Joe Nye, again at the Kennedy School, and also work in Europe, for example, by Caroline Van Ham and others, Jack Thomason, on the legitimacy crisis in Europe. And these authors again say, there's a major value in having trust and a major problem if it declines. And this goes back to Armand and Verber's work in the very early period of the civic culture. And the trust and the causes of trust have created waves of concern in the 1960s, associated with the riots in American cities, and claims there was a breakdown of social order with the demonstrations on the streets of Tokyo, of Brussels, of London, of New York and Washington. In the 1960s, another wave of issues. In the 1990s, another wave of concern. And in the contemporary era, particularly with the rise of populism in many countries, of course, including many parties in Europe, as well as in the changes in the Republican Party in America, and the way in which it's become a party which is deeply populist and fueling mistrust of the elite establishment, whether it's the fake media, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's of the other party, the opposition party, or the deep state. So let's stand back a little bit and let's just unpack the concepts. What is this cause of concern? So for psychologists and psychological theory, trust is a fixed characteristic. And it's essentially inherited, or it's inborn, or it's a personality trait. So for them, you can think about trust in terms of things, just like we think about, say, introversion or extroversion, or optimism and pessimism, as a broad characteristic we learn from our parents. It's kind of fixed. Now, if that's the case, we shouldn't actually see that many trends over time, nor should it change that much. But we might well see that there are real differences at the individual level in how far some people are trusting and other people are not. Sociological theories, by contrast, give us a slightly different perspective, although it's also seen that trust is kind of stable and it's enduring. But here what we're emphasizing is the culture. In other words, the society, the beliefs, the norms, the attitudes which are characteristic of that culture, acquired through socialization in early childhood. And if we think about, for example, European contrasts, which have always been existing, and the differences between a more cynical culture in Italy or in Spain or in Greece, in Mediterranean Europe, versus high levels of trust in Nordic areas and in North Europe, such as in Norway, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, and so on. And the work of Inglehart has always emphasized that certainly there are changes over time which arise from generational shifts as the younger generation comes in and the older generation gradually dies out through population change. So we can see long-term enduring changes in culture and in trust. And of course, Bob Putnam also has emphasized generational shifts as his way of understanding the difference between the pre-war generation and the post-war generation. But both of these accounts focus on trust rather than trustworthiness. And my book, and the work of more recent scholars, has said we need to focus much more on trustworthiness, which can be understood not about me or you, but about us. It's a partnership. It's about agents and principles. And it's defined in my book as an informal social contract where principles, i.e. you and I, or citizens, authorize agents, for example, a lawyer, a doctor, or a neighbor to help us, or government authorities, or international forms of trustworthiness amongst states. So it's an informal social contract where we ask somebody else to act on our behalf in the expectations that the agent will fulfill their responsibilities. So, for example, with NATO, member states belong to that organization for the classic reason they believe that if they have a problem of security, others will act collectively on their behalf to deter any foreign threats across their borders. And when we think and unpack that, again, what are we expecting? We're expecting the other agent, the other partner, to act with competency. In other words, they have the capacity to act, they have the defense resources, they have the qualifications, they have the skills, to act with integrity, meaning with honesty, transparency, that if we have a promise or a treaty, if we have a contract, it'll be fulfilled, and also with impartiality, that the agent is not going to simply benefit themselves, they're not going to pocket the fees without delivering the services, that governments are not simply there to benefit themselves, but to benefit citizens and to act in ways which are going to improve their societies, and that on an international treaty, countries don't just go along with it when it benefits themselves, but when it benefits the collectivity that they're part of. You're not part of the European Union just to get certain benefits. I believe a recent politician said that you shouldn't treat the European Union as a cash cow, where if you get benefits for your agricultural sectors, that's great, but you refuse to go along, for example, on agreements on the distribution of refugees and human rights for migrants within the European Union. So trustworthiness is this relationship, and it operates particularly under conditions of risk and uncertainty. So what we need to do is not just trust somebody else, but trust but verify. We need information to know who to trust and who not to trust, in particular in high-risk situations. And so we need to work out whether, for example, a leader is trustworthy, whether they're competent, whether they will benefit their society, or whether they're untrustworthy, whether they're demagogues, who are there to give false information, misinformation, to act in ways which are dividing rather than producing cooperation. We need to know whether, when we're dealing with a lawyer, they're trustworthy, or whether we basically have a contract with a surgeon or a doctor, or whether we're going to take the virus. Do we think it's actually something which is going to benefit everybody in our society and ourselves by protecting us? Or do we think it's untrustworthy because of all the conspiracies which are being disseminated both through legacy media like Fox, as well as through conspiratorial online sources like QAnon? So we all make mistakes when we're judging this. It's a complicated matter. How do we know whether a virus is going to be defeated by a COVID vaccine? We don't. We're not scientists ourselves. So biased judgments rely upon cultural biases. For example, I don't believe in vaccinations in general, so I'm not going to believe in this one. And psychological cues. It might be blind faith in a leader who's untrustworthy, affective predispositions like party loyalties. If I'm a Republican, I might think I should believe that side, but not the Democrats. Motivated reasoning, where you get reasons that confirm but don't disconfirm your prior values. Selective perceptions, habitual loyalties, media different. In other words, there's lots of reasons why we get it wrong. But too much compliant trust is just as problematic as too little. And the normative ideal is not to trust blindly, not to trust in a high level, instead to have skeptical trust relationships. And in earlier work, I talked about this in terms of critical citizens, but I've developed this in this to really think through what evidence we'd have as to whether our trustworthy judgments are accurate or whether they're not. And I'm arguing that when we make a judgment, we look at a reputation of an agent. Have they delivered in the past? Have they proved trustworthy? And then the general accountability mechanisms. Say that doctor in the past has a good reputation, but fails in a particular case. Are there guidelines with the medical association to make sure they're struck off the register if they don't behave appropriately? And again, a party may well have proved trustworthy in the past amongst their loyalists, but again, if they're not behaving in the public interest, are there ways to get rid of them by kicking them out through elections? So this gives us 4 relationships. We can think about trust by principles, can be positive or negative. I can be trusting or not trusting. And the performance of agents can be positive or negative, depending on how they behave. And so you get skeptical trust, where you individually as a citizen have a positive view of trust in politics and the political system works. And I'd argue a case like Sweden exemplifies that. And many other European governments as well. But you can also have skeptical mistrust. For example, if your government is corrupt, if they're self-serving, if they're ineffective. Think about governments in many parts of the world. Think about a state like Haiti, for example, with a recent coup d'etat, where the state was destabilized. It's a failed state through both the problems of the pandemic. It can't deliver services, and nor can it even deliver basic security and stability. In that context, with a risky situation, you should, as a citizen, be skeptical and mistrusting. But you also get these other situations, which I'm arguing worldwide are equally problematic. Cynicism we know about. Cynicism is where you as a citizen don't trust your government, even if the government is actually acting in your benefits. For example, when Americans don't trust Dr. Fauci, giving accurate scientific and peer-reviewed evidence about the validity of wearing masks or having the vaccine, that's cynicism, which is corrosive for the community you live in and for your own individual benefits. You are cynical mistrusters. But also, here's the other problem, credulous trust. People who turned up for the January 5th insurrection, believing the election was fake or fraudulent, which it wasn't, according to all the court evidence, according to all the other sources of information that we have. Those who believe that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president are those who are credulous by following a leader who is giving information which is inaccurate, by following a party which is claiming there was fraud when there was in fact none. And you can think of this even more broadly. Think about cases like China, think about cases like North Korea, where citizens are blindly following their government in ways which are against their own interests, and of course, against the interests of the international community. And I'm arguing in the book that there are two sources of factors which really lead to these perceptual errors when we either have cynicism or credulity. One is the information society. People living in open and closed societies get very different sources of information from the media. If you live in a country with state censorship, where there's no freedom of the press, where the state controls the media, and there's no freedom of expression for criticism, that's a problem, or where misinformation is widespread, or where the government is not transparent. But there's also problems at individual level. If individuals don't have the analytical capacities, the knowledge or the skills to understand what's going on in the information around them. And that's to do with your education, your political knowledge, your interests, and your prior cultural values. Okay, that's the theory. Here's the model, which is just very briefly an allusion to how we try to test this empirically. So judgments of trustworthiness should relate to performance indicators of competency, integrity, and impartiality. Things like levels of transparency and corruption, for example, how the World Bank has assessed government. And then that gets mediated through public perceptions, which in turn is influenced by your individual information and the information, and that leads to your judgments of trustworthiness. And then there's a feedback loop, etc. I can't go into all of this, obviously, it's far too much. But let me just give you a brief synopsis of the design to test some of this. We first need to measure public levels of trust in diverse agents and societies. And that's where the European Value Survey and the World Value Survey comes in. Then we need objective indicators of performance. And that's where indicators like the World Bank or VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Project, come in. And then we compare the two. Where they're correlated, that's an indication of skeptical trust or skeptical mistrust. Where they're not correlated, then that's an indication of cynicism or credulity. And there are many different indicators we can use. It depends which ones we choose. But they're both at macro level in society and at micro level at the individual level. For example, I can look at rates of GDP growth as a measure of economic competency for the government, or I can measure levels of good governance, for example, levels of democracy, or I can look at individual levels. How far are people satisfied with their household economy? And how far do they feel that government is working with competency and impartiality, for example, perceptions of corruption? I'm using data from the European and World Value Survey, and we've got 7 waves, and I'm drawing in particular on the most recent wave, which has just been finished, 2017 to 2021, currently covering over 100 societies, and measures of interpersonal trust, institutional confidence, and trust in governance, and some new batteries in some very authoritarian cases. This is the coverage worldwide, and it's a cumulative coverage over many, many decades and many years, a partnership organization where we cover many societies. I'm part of the executive of that. We are worst off in covering Africa, but we do cover every country. And of course, from the very beginning, we've covered America under Ron Inglehart's work, along with many countries in Europe under the work of the European Value Survey. Here are some of the questions which we've got in the survey. And this is simply the factor analysis to show how they cluster. So we have a lot of questions now on things like trust in the European Union, the United Nations, the WHO. They come together as a trust in global governance scale. Trust in the national governments that I'll focus on to present a little snapshot of results. Trust in Parliament, the government, political parties, etc. Trust in social movements, trust in the media, and trust in outgroups like people from different countries or people from different religions, and trust in in-groups, and that's people who are friends or people who you've known for many years. I won't go into this in the interest of time, but I'll just give you the results and the conclusions. So the emphasis I'm going to give you is how far does living in an open or closed society affect your trust in government? And I'm going to give you some measures first of how far there is at macro level an effective democracy, how far there's levels of corruption, or how far there's levels of good governance. What do we see? So here's a simple correlation. It's not a multivariate, there's no controls, because all of these are interrelated. But let's look in our range of open societies worldwide, countries like Belgium, like France, like Norway, and the United States, how far there's a correlation between trusting government as a scale, meaning trusting governments, parliaments, political parties, and civil service, with societal level indicators of good governance measured by the World Bank and VDEM. And the classification of open and closed societies is based on the varieties of democracy measure of freedom of expression and alternative sources of information. And we've simply divided that into two to look at basically closed societies and open societies. Closed societies are exemplified by China. Open societies are exemplified by, say, Switzerland. And immediately you can see that across all of the open societies, when we pull them together, we have about 40. We can see there's a strong correlation between the quality of governance, how well it works, whether the government controls corruption, whether it's seen as effective, whether it's stable, whether there's rule of law. And we can see there's a correlation between that and public opinion. The better the quality of governance, the higher the level of public trust. And it's a strong and significant associations in 43 societies. And it's also there for our measure of liberal democracy. The more democratic the society, in open societies, the stronger the public trust. That makes sense. We all would go along with that in terms of our prior values and look at closed societies. And what you can see is a really interesting pattern across all of those closed societies where there's state control of the media, where independent journalists are restricted, where there's little criticism of the government, and where the information people get is one-sided. In other words, it's propaganda or a positive view of the government. Then we can see that there's no significant relationship with the actual quality of how government works, or it's negative. The more that there's a democratic society and that democracy works, the more negative the relationship to public trust in 35 countries around the world. Let me show you. Here's the Good Governance Index from the World Bank, and here are the societies. The countries which are with the green are the countries which are open. The countries which are red are the countries which are closed. On the vertical axis, we have the summary of whether or not the government by the World Bank experts is seen as low or high in the quality of how it works. And across the bottom, we have the Trust in Government Index. And again, it immediately shows you that in nearly all cases where the green line goes up, a country like Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland has high levels of good governance, according to the World Bank, and some of the highest levels of political trust in the world. And we can see that's true of a range of other countries as well, including some new democracies like Estonia and Taiwan, as well as older democracies like Australia. And the United States there is pretty low in terms of trust in government, and it's lower than some European countries in trust in actually how governance works. Now, some countries which are there, in particular like Peru, are countries which are open societies, but with low levels of trust and with low levels of good governance for all sorts of reasons, with high levels of corruption and instability. We can also spot there Singapore, which is high in good governance and in trust, but is a closed society in terms of the classification by VDEM. So there's a couple of exceptions, but by and large, if you look at the red line, you can see that the most closed societies are the ones which have both high trust, but low quality governance. Countries like Vietnam, China, Tajikistan. And look at China again. It has more trust amongst the public than a country like Norway. The Philippines, Bangladesh, Myanmar, where the military junta has just taken over again after a brief period of democratic openness, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, where Erdogan has restricted the role of media and academics and really pushed back on human rights ever since the attempted coup d'etat. Thailand, where a military junta again took over from a country which used to have effective opposition parties. Iran, under the Ayatollah, Pakistan, which is in bed with Afghanistan to destabilize the region. Ethiopia, which again, we've seen real risks of open civil war breaking out. Russia under Putin, Belarus, where protest was suppressed and where there have been real problems in terms of dissidents being imprisoned. Kyrgyzstan, Zimbabwe. Now, again, they're not the only countries in that category of credulous trust. We can spot countries like Nigeria and Indonesia with more open societies, Kenya, which was more open, certainly, but nevertheless, by and large, as you can see, the more the closed society, the more there's both trust, but trust which is misplaced in terms of governance, credulous trust, not skeptical trust. And again, we can see some countries where we have cynical mistrust. I put Italy into that category, Romania, Croatia. There's the legacy, in particular in post-communist countries, to not trust, even though, according to the quality of governance, according to the World Bank, it's pretty good. And again, we have some countries where there's both mistrust and poor level governance. Lebanon is a classic case in point, where we've seen the incredible hyperinflation, political destabilization, incompetence in government shown by the explosion in the port, and you shouldn't trust. And the government itself, the state itself, has really failed. And Iraq is a classic case again, where despite elections and despite some opposition, nevertheless, you could argue quite clearly the government is not working and the public is very mistrustful. I won't go into this, but again, this shows you the same pattern, but more dramatic in terms of liberal democracy. The vertical axis is the quality of liberal democracy, and the horizontal is trust in government. Trust in government goes up the less democratic the country, and the reason is the lack of information about the quality of governance in that country. Economic competency, we see a similar pattern. Just to finish off, should it be the case that the better the economic performance, the higher the level of trust? It should be the case. Instead, however, we find that relationship does work consistently in open societies. The higher the level of economic growth, the higher the level of public trust, the greater the public level of economic development, the lower the level of unemployment, the more the public trust. The more egalitarian society, the more the public trust. The more unequal, the less the public trust. The lower the level of homicides, the higher the level of education, etc. There's a logical relationship between the competence of the government and public trust. In open societies, the relationship is broken except for one indicator of unemployment. So people aren't trusting these governments because of economic development. They're trusting them because they don't have the information to be critical citizens and to have an accurate information that would allow them to judge the trustworthiness of their government. And again, I won't go into this and I won't go into that. The conclusions, because I know I've run over, I believe. Number one, we should challenge the normative assumptions that trust is valuable. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But what it needs to be is a relationship which is based on trust but verify. You need information to know that who you're trusting is not a con artist, is not a demagogue, is not somebody who's going to mislead you. And in international circumstances, when you apply this, this means when you sign a treaty, that the treaty needs to be followed. Hungary and the immigrants are a classic case in point. In joining the European Union, there are certain European values which member states are meant to follow. That's the nature of the European Union. It's the Paris Agreement and so on. And if a country joins but does not go along with the treaty obligations, then they're untrustworthy, and that's a problem. Trust is always valuable for agents. They want you to trust them. Of course they do, just like a con artist does, by inducing compliance. But it's not always in the interest of the principal. We get things wrong when we try to judge whether there are errors because we have lack of information, and that leads to both cynicism and credulity. And there are both problems at individual level and at societal level in closed societies. And in our literature, as scholars, in our media, when covering this, the risks of credulous trust are underestimated. This is a risk. This gets things wrong. And we need to really take that much more seriously than we have in the past. Thank you all very much. I hope that that's been a helpful overview of the book. I hope it starts to make us question trust. And I look forward to your questions and the comments and the next section of the presentations, which I look forward to, in particular, Mr. Berliner, about trust and transparency in the US and EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Norris, for this very insightful, very inspirational lecture, very dense lecture, also based on a lot of evidence from European Value Survey, International Value Survey. So I'm sure there will be questions, and I would like to ask the audience to put their questions in the Q&A, and we will rephrase them for you. We will ask them to our two speakers, actually, today, later this evening or later in the day. So please stay with us, both the audience and Professor Norris. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor, and here I'm back, but I really wanted to abuse the fact that I know Nicolas Berliner, and so it's really an absolute privilege and a personal pleasure to introduce you. You're the Chargé d'Affaires ad interim at the US Embassy. For those who are less familiar with the words that are used in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, a Chargé d'Affaires is in fact an acting ambassador, the person who does the work of an ambassador together with his or her team. So it is important. I had the pleasure to meet Nicolas Berliner in Washington, D.C. When he was director of the Office for Russian Affairs at the State Department, and before that he also held another important function. He was the director for Central Asian Affairs at the National Security Council in the White House. That's where the policy of a certain geographical area, in case Central Asia, is coordinated. Nicolas, you speak 5 languages. I wanted to highlight this because I can't see of a better preparation to come to Belgium than speaking several languages. I also want to say that I kept or maintain the professional habit of following the US ambassador in Belgium on social media, so I can testify to the fact that since you arrived in August 2019, you've been extremely active with yourself in the first place, but also with your team. And I wanted to thank you for that, for keeping the relationship really at a high level. Thank you also for accepting the invitation today. And I'm sure that your remarks will be of interest to our audience. And I echo the invitation by Professor Danos to prepare your questions already now. Thank you. Please.
So thank you, Ambassador Wouters, for that kind introduction. Professor Norris, thank you for that fascinating presentation. I'm sure that will elicit quite a few questions from the students. Distinguished professors of KU Leuven, students and faculty, and of course those who are watching online. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm very pleased to hear that there will be an American component to this prestigious European Studies program here at KU Leuven. The stellar reputation of this university, I think, is well known in academic circles around the world, and the U.S. Embassy certainly looks forward to continuing the partnership that we've had over the years with KU Leuven. It's wonderful Ambassador Wouters can be here this evening. As a senior Belgian diplomat, I think he has also seen and participated firsthand in our transatlantic relationship. As Ambassador Wouters said, I'm the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy, and just a little bit of biographical information here to start. I've been an American diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service for the last 23 years. I've served in 7 different countries, and of course, since our political appointee ambassador departed with the change of the administration in January, it's been my responsibility to lead our embassy here in Brussels and to take care of our partnership and our relationship with the wonderful country of Belgium. Over the course of my career, the transatlantic relationship has been really at the foundation of much of what I have worked on, ranging from finding common ground vis-a-vis our relations with Russia, to integrating former Warsaw Pact countries into our community as democratic partners. I've served in Moscow, Tbilisi, Georgia, Kabul, Zagreb in Croatia, Tashkent in Uzbekistan, here in Brussels previously at our mission to NATO, and of course at the various assignments in Washington that the ambassadors mentioned. All of these assignments provided me with an interesting lens through which to observe and understand the transatlantic relationship from many different angles, and also to appreciate its importance. During my time in the State Department, I've witnessed the dynamics of this relationship vividly. From large crowds protesting various US policies at various times, but also to enthusiastic crowds lining up in the hopes of catching a glimpse of a US president during a visit to Europe. I've seen the ebbs and flows of our relationship firsthand. The last time I was assigned to Brussels, about 20 years ago, was at the start of the Iraq War. And that was something that produced a deep rift in our transatlantic relationship at that time, including, by the way, with Belgium. And we even feared then at NATO that these disagreements could split the alliance and indeed threaten its very existence. But yet at the end of the day, I think all parties realized that the stakes were a lot higher than that immediate disagreement. And we ultimately found a way forward through communication and compromise, i.e. through diplomacy. Pew Research polls over the last 20 years illustrate how both American popularity and favorable views of US policy in Europe have fluctuated between lows of about 30% and then sometimes highs near 70%. So what does this say about trust in our transatlantic relationship? Is it unpredictable or unreliable? Or is this data based on snapshots of moments in the ongoing and evolving relationship between the United States and Europe? We have read and heard concerns that US priorities shift too dramatically between presidential administrations, and that this creates unease amongst our close friends and allies. And I'm not sure that's completely true. Priorities do indeed evolve, and as in every democracy, of course, a new administration brings with it changes that reflect the platform on which those particular leaders were elected. However, if you consider actual policy, I would argue that very little has fundamentally changed in our bilateral relationship, both with Belgium and also with Europe more broadly. Nevertheless, we can't deny that there is in fact a sense of unease among many Americans, Belgians, and Europeans. Not only are there doubts about our alliance, but there are even doubts about our values and the democratic system at the core of our identities as nations. We're up against deep inequities, systemic racism, political polarization, each of which makes our democracies less resilient. Trust in our alliances has been shaken. Trust in each other, trust in the strength of our commitments. Our shared values of democracy and human rights are being challenged in new ways, not only from other countries and foreign non-state actors, but also from within our own borders. In just a few days, President Biden will host the first Summit for Democracy, a virtual summit for leaders from government, civil society, and the private sector. They will focus on challenges and opportunities facing us as democracies. It'll provide a platform for leaders to announce both individual and collective commitments, reforms, and initiatives to defend democracy and human rights, both at home and abroad. It is important to highlight the fact that this is a summit at which the United States will also make commitments to strengthen our own democracy. We acknowledge our own imperfections and will confront them openly and transparently. As President Biden said, democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, and renew it. The tragic scenes of the angry mob attacking the US Capitol on January 6th are unforgettable. I never imagined I would see something like that in my own nation's capital. I'm still shocked at the thought of people breaking through doors and into the building that stands at the heart of our democracy and our system. I've seen such scenes in other countries where I've served, but never did I imagine seeing it at home. The overwhelming majority of Americans I think were rightly appalled, and those responsible for those actions are now being brought to account to the fullest extent under the law. Just a few weeks after the riots, however, a reassuring and uplifting scene also unfolded at that very same building, a reminder of the strength and the endurance of our democracy. In a peaceful and dignified ceremony, Joe Biden was sworn in as president and spoke these words: "What are the common objects we love that define us as Americans? I think I know. Opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and yes, the truth." I recommend reading and watching the speech, as I think you, as students of American policy, should read our recent inaugural speeches. They capture much about the priorities and also the challenges of time. Truth matters, of course. If you don't believe someone is telling you the truth, you won't trust that person or the relationships you share. Trust and truth make up the foundation, indeed, of all human interaction. Sadly, in today's fast-paced society, it is relatively easy to sow doubt and undermine truth, even when the facts are in plain sight for all to see. When I was a kid, people watched the evening news and read local newspapers, and just about everyone was reading or seeing more or less the same news presented in more or less a similar way once or twice a day. Reporters had more time to reflect on their stories. Live events were relatively rare. Traveling to Europe was a luxury or necessity, and therefore the easiest connection between the United States and Europe at that time was a very expensive call made on a landline phone with a cord. There was no internet, no cell phones, and no CNN. Now, decades later, our modern world is interconnected in extraordinary ways. If the young diplomat I was in the early 2000s could have predicted even half of what we can accomplish today and a fraction of the tools that we would have, I probably could have gone to Las Vegas, placed a few bets, and become extraordinarily wealthy. I do believe that having more sources of news is a positive development generally, that people no longer hear from a single source, such as an evening broadcast or 3 or 4 outlets, but can choose among dozens of reputable sources and media outlets from around the world. This is positive. Today, we have more information available than ever before. Within just a few minutes, I can check multiple US news sites, or the BBC, Le Monde, Le Soir here, VRT. The list is endless, goes on and on. Governments, companies, and universities can reach out to people in real time, create full digital programs to help during this crisis, such as this event here tonight. Current teleworking tools have jumped light years ahead as a result of the pandemic. We all know what Zoom and team meetings are, and we use them on a regular basis. Just a few years ago, it would have been a rare thing to have Dr. Norris join us from the United States via video conference. And of course, nothing really replaces, I think, having somebody in person. So we hope also that Dr. Norris will actually be able to come here to Leuven and join this program and address this audience at some point soon. But now in 2021, though the world remains the same size as it has always been, it feels much smaller and far more interconnected. And while news and all kinds of information can be shared at the speed of light, our ability to process it all has suffered. Many people have become entrenched in their media habits, relying exclusively on what they perceive as their source of information and remaining wary or skeptical of all others. As President Biden put it when he spoke in Brussels during his trip here in June, we're in the midst of terrible beauty having been born. Evolutions in information technology, but also in jobs, automation, artificial intelligence, tremendous progress, but with a lot of questions and anxiety. As W.B. Yeats wrote, a terrible beauty has been born, Our free and open society is vulnerable to nefarious actors who undermine trust in our governments and our alliances. For example, Russia's use of disinformation to erode confidence in elections and vaccines that have been proven to be safe and effective is just one example of these actions that affect not only individual countries, but also our whole international community. Multiple non-democratic nations are using disinformation campaigns, weaponized corruption to fuel distrust in our democracies, and mounting cyber attacks that target our critical infrastructure and steal intellectual property. President Biden mentioned jobs and economic security. Over the last few decades, all our nations have outsourced many jobs, and a great deal of manufacturing has shifted to China and the Far East. The global supply chain has suffered greatly, and the pandemic has forced this issue now to the forefront. Anyone trying to buy a new car or even a bicycle right now will find that many companies have backlogs of up to a year due to a shortage of necessary microchips and other parts. China and Russia are increasingly using access to critical resources, markets, and technologies to pressure our allies and drive wedges between us. It is essential that the United States and Europe work together to pressure China to participate in an open global economy and follow trade rules and regulations. Europe and the United States have a shared interest in ensuring that others abide by those rules of the road. And neither the US nor Europe can do this alone. We need to do it together. Global leaders gathered in Glasgow recently to address one of the most important challenges that we all collectively face today, the climate crisis. The United States was present at the highest levels of government to illustrate our commitment to work on joint strategies with other nations. The climate crisis is a global challenge, one that neither the United States nor Europe can solve alone. We must work together. The climate crisis affects so many aspects of our lives: agriculture, security, infrastructure. We could go on and on. Increasingly, we're seeing its consequences, such as the extreme weather that caused devastating floods in Belgium this summer and in neighboring countries. And if we're to keep within reach the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, every nation must do its best, particularly highly industrialized nations like our own. We can't afford to sit back. We must meet this challenge head on and accept that climate affects the lives and futures of all of us. Rising to face this great challenge also offers great opportunities. How can we expand access to affordable clean energy? How can we build green infrastructure? President Biden's recently passed infrastructure bill outlines how such efforts can also create new jobs. Many other issues we can talk about, but I want to bring us back to the topic of the day, namely the status of our transatlantic relationship and trust. I've talked about anxious populations, increased distrust in governments and institutions, in news and information, and our increased fear of threats posed by other nations and the global climate crisis. While I'm concerned about the status of our world, I'm also hopeful. It is when our governments and our commitments, our very systems of values are being challenged that we must go back to where our alliances took shape in the mid-20th century, less than 100 years ago. Our alliances were created to defend shared values, to create international relations based on a free and open, rules-based order. When under threat, we should respond as allies and work together to reduce our vulnerability. That means ensuring our economies are more integrated than those of our principal competitors. We must develop cutting-edge innovations, ensure that our supply chain remains resilient, set the norms and standards that will govern emerging technologies, and impose costs on those who break the rules. Consider the research breakthroughs on COVID-19. I don't think the town of Puurs, here near Antwerp, has ever been so prominently featured in global media as it is now, and rightly so. Fighting the pandemic depends on international cooperation, shared research, and shared goals. We all have strong economic ties to China, but that cannot be the only basis of our relationship. We have made joint efforts with Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom to hold individuals accountable for committing atrocities against Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We must remain firm and united in our commitments also to human rights. While governments can do a lot, though, in the end it is up to each and every one of us to protect and defend democratic values and human rights. Extremist narratives tend to find fertile ground in societies with high levels of corruption, discrimination, disregard for human rights, and religious freedom. It is also important to counter misinformation and disinformation, as well as this polarizing rhetoric, particularly when it contributes to the anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and xenophobic narratives, and to the loss of faith in democratic values. We as individuals can take action against this. When we see or read something, to call it out, to flag it for what it is. We're stronger when we condemn what undermines our shared values. We can't be complacent. About a month ago, I attended 2 events in West Flanders. The first was a torchlit commemoration reflecting on the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, where in just a 3-month period, 325,000 Allied and 260,000 German soldiers were killed for a gain of about 6 kilometers. The day after, on November 11th, I stood under the Menin Gate in Ypres with Prime Minister De Croo, along with many other ambassadors, in honor of the anniversary of the end of World War I. Standing under the gate, which lists the names of nearly 55,000 missing from the Commonwealth countries, is a deeply moving experience. Just take a moment to think about those numbers. More than 500,000 casualties over a period of a few months and a gain of just a few kilometers. The remains of 55,000 names there were never found. Those who died there were the age of university students, like all of you. An entire generation lost. And only 30 years after that, Europe was again engulfed by violence for a second time in the 20th century. If we look back at history, we see that peace in Europe, the peace Europe has enjoyed since the end of the Second World War, is sadly not the historical norm. It is an historical aberration made possible only by our willingness to have learned these hard lessons. It is also the unique result of strong alliances, the ties between European nations and across the Atlantic that have endured ever since. Belgium, I believe, understood the high price of inaction and therefore was a leader in the creation of both the European Union and NATO. Our common values are built on a shared experience of the last century. And as this new century continues to unfold, we will continue to hold different views from time to time on policy and continue to agree and disagree as we've done over these past years and decades. But our common goals, we need to remember, are much stronger than anything that can divide us. Trust, of course, as in all human relations, is also the essence of diplomatic relations and relations between nations. It's what's guided me and I think all other diplomats. And I've seen the power of our transatlantic partnership and the trust on which it rests. And I have no doubt that this will remain the cornerstone of our U.S. foreign policy for the decades to come. And I think one only has to walk the battlefields of Belgium to see what is at stake and to see what would happen should we fail in that endeavor. Thank you.
Maybe answering some questions. Okay. Yes, please. Okay, so we now move on to the Q&A session, and we're lurking at the screen here just to see and monitor what questions come in. We don't have that many questions still, so please, if you have a question, now is the time. So, but maybe I could kick off and ask a question to both of you, and that question is about the populist wave that has swept across the democratic world. And, well, we may more or less know what are the economic and the social causes of this wave, but in terms of how to react to it as a policymaker, as a public official, as a journalist, as professional agents, how should democratic leaders and representatives of democratic leadership react, in fact? Is there a way to respond in a good way, in an adequate way, knowing all these data that we just saw, that Professor Norris showed us from all over the world? What is your, also your practice? What does the practice tell you? How can democratic leaders respond to this populist wave? Perhaps I give the floor to Professor Norris first.
So thank you, Lien. And this is obviously a critical question. Now we've had so many governments where parties have really risen in power. And there's basically 4 or 5 different ways to respond. One is to say it's not necessarily a problem, it's an outlet. In other words, the public is dissatisfied and they're angry with cultural change or abortion, or they're annoyed with, angry with immigration, etc. So this is an outlet, like any other party. Even if you don't agree with them, they should have a legitimate right to be there. Secondly, you could take the Biden strategy, which is to say, let's go for economic equality and try to make the economy work better for the blue-collar workers, for the less well-off, for those who feel that they've lost out economically. And that's very much the focus of his infrastructure projects and his currently Build Back Better bill, stuck in Congress, but nevertheless his initiative. Problem is, if the causes aren't economic, then the solution won't be effective either. A third is to try to think through generational changes, or just to say, well, look, over time, things are going to shift as older generations eventually will move, and younger generations who are more inclined to think about cultural change and be more positive towards issues like environments or gay rights or women's rights. But, you know, if we wait for generational change, it's a long process. So the last solution, which is the one I favor, of course, is to think through institutional reforms. And here the problem is in America that the system is so stuck, so frozen, the Constitution has had so little change, and the actual rules of the game are often at state level, and at state level it's Republicans who are pushing back on things like electoral rights and voter suppression. They're using voter suppression rather than moving forward. So institutional reforms have been on the table, and the Fair Vote Act that was put forward by the Democrats to try to be debated in the House has come forward on a number of occasions, along with the John Lewis Vote Act, which would restore some of the federal oversight of elections. So far, they've not managed to get even debate because the Republicans have blocked them. The only way to get debate is to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, and that requires Joe Manchin to say, hey, democracy's on the line, which it is. But whether or not, you know, the Democrats are going to actually say that is the big question for the next year before the 2022 elections, when all on the cards, it looks as though the Democrats are going to lead their majority in the House and the Senate.
Thank you. Mr. Billey?
Well, I think Professor Norris has summarized the problem very well. I mean, this is what President Biden is trying to do, for example, with not only with the economic initiatives that she's noted in the United States, but also diplomatically. And so I mentioned this summit for democracy that's taking place next week. And that's actually what this is about. And it's looking, so, you know, not only for us in the United States, but asking all of our democratic allies and partners also to look at their own countries and to come forward with things that they can do to strengthen their own governance, to strengthen their democracy. And this really rests, I think, on an identification of the problem as being partially an erosion of trust, and that we are at a time where we're facing our own populations who are increasingly, as we've seen, distrustful of government and the efficiency of government, the ability of government to tackle what are now increasingly complex and global problems. And then this also being posed against authoritarian, non-democratic regimes, such as China and others, who are proposing another model and essentially putting out there, positing that, that an authoritarian sort of top-down model of governance is what it takes to take the challenges that we have today.
Yeah, people love democracy as a notion, but they don't like the messiness of it or the concrete aspects of democracy, I guess. Yeah.
What Churchill said, the worst form of government except for all others.
Yeah. So. I don't know what you want.
So before formulating the 3 questions that we already received from students, and there are some more coming, I want to thank obviously also Mr. Berliner and Professor Norris for the 2 speeches, and they already have a topic for next year. That is, to what extent is there an interrelationship between the diminishing trust within the transatlantic community on the EU's and America's ability to have a foreign policy focused on democracy and human rights? Because there might be an interrelationship between these two factors. But you don't have to answer it now. That's for the next lecture. Okay. Later on. There are 3 questions from students, and I start with the first. The first question is, how do you manipulate trust as a political actor and in a transatlantic strategic relationship? So should politicians, should leaders, diplomats manipulate trust to try to increase this trust? No. That's the first question. The second question is, how do you rebuild trust in mainstream media? How can this trust be rebuilt? And once again here, what is the role of who? And then the third question is, are we sure that in the public's perception, we still share the same values within Europe and in the United States? So that are the 3 questions that we already have.
Okay.
And perhaps I give first the floor to Professor Norris.
So you'd like me to start?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. So I think it's the wrong frame and a way to talk about manipulating trust. What you have to improve is trustworthiness. In other words, it's not about the public, it's not about citizens, it's not about public opinion, it's not about necessarily even the media, it's about how things work. And we need to have institutions which are more effective, which are more transparent, which are more have high levels of integrity. And so if you could get governments which were more trustworthy, then you wouldn't have so much of an erosion. But also even the assumption that there's a steady erosion is somewhat misleading, because what you find in many countries is ups and downs. And the book which I mentioned earlier about Europe by Caroline Van Ham, Jacques Thomasson and others, which looked into the legitimacy crisis in Europe, very much said it's not so much of a crisis. In fact, in some years, in some countries, it goes up. In some countries, it goes down, which often reflects things like performance. When you have an economic crisis in 2007-8, confidence goes down. When you have a pandemic in which the government is seen to have a major role to rebuild and produce public health, trust went up. So there's fluctuations, but what we really want to have is trustworthy institutions, so people feel that they are accountable, responsive, all the usual things that we talk about when we talk about good governance and liberal democracy, basically. And liberal democracy is clearly in fundamental challenge right now. Worldwide, it is going down. There's some good evidence from VDEM, in particular, that there's been a decline. It's not going back to where it used to be, obviously, in the 1990s or in the 1980s. It's a modest kind of shift overall, but really critical. And of course, very much associated with authoritarian populist leaders coming to power in those particular countries, in Nicaragua, in Turkey, in Philippines, in the United States, in Hungary, and many other places around the world. So there are challenges, obviously, for democracy, very serious challenges. But again, let's get the reform agenda on the front burner. Let's try to push forward on that in America, but also in many other countries. Last point, many of the countries where we do see an increasing dissatisfaction has been those where you get populism and majoritarian institutions. In other words, think about the United Kingdom and Brexit. In fact, the Conservatives and the Eurosceptics never had a majority, they had a plurality, but they got in government repeatedly because the opposition was divided, and that meant that Brexit went through, but there was great dissatisfaction amongst those who really felt that Britain should be part of Europe. In America, under Trump got, remember, 3 million less votes in the popular vote in the 2016 election, 7 million less in the 2020 election. Yet, of course, Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016 because of the Electoral College, because of majoritarian institutions. So the challenge, lastly, is political polarization on many different issues, culture wars in particular, not economic issues, and then majoritarian institutions, which allows a minority to rule. And many European countries have overcome that. They have consociation or consensus institutions, like in Belgium, like in the Netherlands, like in Sweden. And that allows populists to be represented, but not necessarily to be overrepresented by basically having a winner-take-all system.
So maybe just 2 points on that. I think that in our transatlantic relationship, that trust between the US and Europe, and at least the popular perception in Europe of the United States and the trust that Europeans have in the United States, I think this tracks very closely with sort of how concordant or discordant our policies are at any given time. So, clearly, when I was here 20 years ago, there were deep divisions over the Iraq War. It was a very divisive issue in the United States as well, which I think sometimes outside observers fail to appreciate, the spectrum of opinion there, that it's not only whatever is coming out of the White House. And so we see that, and we see, for example, now with President Biden, we've seen a high degree of concordancy. We're working together on a host of issues, and this is almost immediately translated into, improved perceptions of the United States and also of President Biden. Indeed, his, approval ratings may be higher in Europe right now than in the United States. And of course, partially that's also, I think, sometimes just done as a comparison and kind of, who people like and they dislike. I think the last question there, though, was about sort of the larger issue of our values and whether or not we still share values. I think that very much we do. We are systems in many ways, and the philosophies on which they're based, of course, have common roots. And I think that this, informs a lot of how we see the world. So I think that in general we tend to see it in largely similar ways. We obviously have our circumstances, our political circumstances, cultural difference. But I think, by and large, I see the U.S. and Europe, or North America more broadly in Europe, continuing to be closely aligned on sort of a whole host of global issues that we need to address together.
Thank you. We have another cluster here of questions that deal with media and with the parliamentary cooperation here. So maybe I will try to first look at the media question. How can democratic leaders fight fake news, and what do you think about the role of big media corporations in the spread of such fake news? And then there's another question related to that. Individualized information flows as the result of social media, new online media, are impacting political reality. And it looks like this technology is here to stay. How should governments, politicians deal with this new information system and prevent it from eroding public trust? So can it be instrumentalized in a positive way?
Well, I think this is, first of all, I don't think anybody has an answer to these two questions.
Huge questions.
Yeah, they're enormous questions, and we're really very much at the beginning of this shift, of this communications revolution. And so, I think it has been, if we look back to sort of some of the what would now seem to be naive or Pollyannish ideas that were floating in the 1990s about what the internet would do, sort of for information democracy more broadly. Obviously, a lot of those predictions have turned out quite differently. But it's a double-edged sword. We have the advantage of being able to communicate, but it also, I think, puts a greater responsibility on our citizens. And perhaps that's where we're failing, where educational systems are failing in creating an informed citizenry with capacity for critical thinking to be able to separate the truth from falsehoods.
Thank you.
So,
Professor Norris?
I wrote years and years ago when the internet was first taking off, the digital divide book, and I said you had, cyber optimists and cyber pessimists, and I think you still do. So the cyber optimists really thought at the very beginning of the internet, which was really around 1994, with the growth of the mosaic and other forms of online visual web access. People thought it was going to change everything, and democracy would be transformed, and we'd all be very engaged in our communities and so on. And that quickly went down, not totally, but certainly there was great optimism. It was like the media bubble and the internet bubble. And then, of course, the cyber pessimists have always been there as well, dystopian, thinking it's going to take over our lives and is going to be very negative. And I tend to think it's both of these are exaggerated. It's basically a neutral mechanism. It's like a knife and fork or a hammer and a tool in which it can be used. But what we need to think about is the politicization of it, not the technology itself. And again, the question, how can leaders fight fake news? Well, remember that leaders are actually producing fake news. It's not all on one side or the other. It's not all QAnon. It's some of our key leaders in office who are repressing dissent, who are repressing criticism, and who are using fake news all the time. We would not have these challenges to US elections. We would not have the insurrection if it hadn't been for the former president. We would not have all of these challenges going on right now if it was not for Fox News, as well as the other conspiratorial thing, Breitbart News, One America, etc., etc. So again, it's a much more endemic problem. There was a very good article yesterday in the New York Times about exactly this, that we blame the technology, we blame Facebook, we blame Twitter. Journalists do it all the time because it's kind of in your face, it's there. We see the problems on Twitter and so on. But in fact, it's not the technology platforms per se, it's actually a much more deep and structural issue in how our politics are run. And if you're polarized in society, if you're polarized over issues, and if your parties are polarized so they won't talk to each other over culture wars, then that gets translated to the means and the mechanisms which the information is communicated. And again, how should we fight, for example, individualism in social media? Well, it depends again on your context. So if you're a dissident in Myanmar, or you're trying to get human rights expanded in Nicaragua, or you're trying to move in favor of greater liberalization in China, then of course internet is your friend, insofar as there is an independent internet and they can get their message out, they're not being censored and so on. So all things are relative, but basically the technology is not the problem, it's the people who are the problem. That's my kind of core conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I came across this communication by Pew Research 2 days ago, 3 days ago, on the future of digital spaces and their role for democracy. And they asked a bunch of experts, and actually 61% chose the positive side, saying that, yes, by 2035, that was the horizon also, digital spaces and people's uses of them will change in ways that significantly serve the public good, and only, well, the remaining 39% chose the negative option. So, yeah, let's hope for the best. Next question.
There's another question that is more focused on the political dimension and on the question how we can solve the problem of trust or declining trusts. And it's clearly also related to one of the research projects at the University of Leuven. And the question is, to what degree is there a role for parliamentary cooperation between the European Parliament and the US Congress to build trust or rebuild trust in the transatlantic relationship? That's perhaps a question where you might be the first to answer this.
Sure. Well, this is something that comes up a lot, and we do have a certain degree of parliamentary exchange. I would say most of it is more informal, but for example, here in Brussels, we have members of our Congress, both our Senate and House of Representatives, who travel here on a pretty regular basis. And we had a group of them here just a couple of weeks ago, some 9 senators, and had them engaged here in a variety, both with the EU, but also here bilaterally with Belgium. So this happens, but I think, and I think this can certainly be useful, and certainly useful in sort of gaining a more common understanding of, where certain policies and decisions are going. And let me just say that on the US-EU relationship, a lot of this, we must remember, is about economic and trade relations, so norms, regulations, and things like that. So some of them very esoteric and complex. But I think in a broad sense, I don't see that, I think that parliamentary exchange is certainly valuable, certainly makes a good contribution, but I don't think that that's at the level where ultimately the trust is built or undone.
And again, if Biden can again reassure Europe that the changes which he's introduced from the very beginning of his administration are going to stick, things like commitment to climate change and being part of an international movement to try and get rid of, mitigate the effects of the pandemic and many other issues which are highly of concern for Europe, then I think if you actually produce the results, you'll restore that trust. But the problem, of course, is that many in Europe feel that this is a presidency where certainly some alliances have been rebuilt, but whether or not they'll continue just depends on the future of American politics. So I think it's at that level that you need to really focus rather than necessarily on the actual personal interactions between the two institutions.
I have a question for Professor Norris, particularly on how to measure trust across different professional agents. Like, for instance, we had this public day Sunday in Flanders on science. And there was a survey, and the survey mentioned that 7 in 10 Flemings trusted science and trusted scientists. I don't know how that would result in the US, but I wonder, we have a lot of distrust in politics here in Belgium, especially at the national level, less so at the local level. We're more trustful towards our local politicians. So I was just wondering how transitive, if you can say that word, how generic is trust across all these different professional agents? Because I see a lot of discrepancies, I see a lot of difference across, depending on where you look, at which agent you look.
No, absolutely, Lena. I mean, it depends. So what we really need, and we do have now, an awful lot of different actors and agents who are engaged. So you know that the factual analysis I showed you was just a snapshot of some. You can't assume that trust in the media is similar to trust in Congress, or trust in Congress is similar to trust in the presidency, or that social trust or trust in doctors or the medical profession or scientists or teachers or universities, they're all different dimensions. They're all different actors and they perform in different ways. And you might also hold them to account in different ways. So, for example, if there's a lot of financial scandals for MPs, as there has been recently in the UK Westminster Parliament, then that's one set of standards that people apply when when you ask people, do you trust your representative or politicians? On the other hand, if there's other challenges which are out there, which are equally important, where again, there's a major problem in that particular profession, then trust goes up and down for those particular actors, but not more generally. So trust in science has been a general phenomenon, I think, which is big. In America, unfortunately, it's polarized, just like trust in medicine is now polarized much more. Do you trust your doctor, physician? Yes, that's kind of uniform across everybody. But when you say, do you trust Dr. Fauci or the CDC or science or whatever, or even, as we know, climate change, scientists, etc., it's basically a black and white situation between Democrats and Republicans. Because, of course, scientists are experts. Experts are anti-populist.
Thank you.
I have another question which is also related to the comparative analysis of the United States and of Europe. We have seen, and here that's a question for Professor Norris, that the level of trust is higher in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. So what can be learned, given the existing political system in America, from this European experience? And here, obviously, also Mr. Berliner will be able to provide some insights in view of your experience with European countries. So what can be learned in the United States from this European situation?
Well, I think it's, again, the institutional arrangements. In Germany, when Angela Merkel stood down, there was a heated campaign, both to replace her and then to have the election. But of course, in the election, everybody knew it was some form of coalition had to be built after that for the SPD. And so, of course, there isn't so much of the negative politics because you don't want to offend other parties or other parts of the electorate. And even though the AfD has been very strong in Germany and very successful in the previous election, and so that does articulate a particular perspective in Germany, nevertheless, the parties themselves in a consensus democracy, in a power-sharing democracy, know they have to work together afterwards. And America has a system which is so tight, 50-50 on so many different issues, whether it's in Congress or whether it's on different types of political issues as well. And everybody's moved further apart, which is a long-term process, which, by the way, predated Trump. You can see the divisions really starting around 2000 and then getting worse in the Senate and in Congress and in public opinion. So it's a long-term trend of party polarization. And then one party is going to win. And so, of course, one party is going to feel happy. Immediately after Trump got elected in 2016, Republicans suddenly said they had more trust in government and the Democrats lost. And then when Biden came in, we saw the reverse again on the Pew studies or any other public opinion surveys. So it's the winner-take-all nature of American institutions. It's the polarization of cultural issues. And you combine that with the lack of ability to change in America of the actual rules of the game. And it's a perfect storm, basically. And we're heading into it in 2022 in such a predictable fashion. It's going to get worse, everybody believes, in 2024, because the challenges to the elections are strong. The election officials are becoming more partisan. The electoral laws are becoming, in many states, more repressive, although not in every state. And now, just today, we hear that there's going to be more restrictions on Roe v. Wade under the Supreme Court due to the predominance of Republican appointees on that body. And that's it's like throwing gasoline on a fire which is already there. It's just going to make everything worse. So I'm really pessimistic about the future of American democracy if we can't get electoral reforms, and by the way, not just voting rights, but many other reforms through the Senate in the next year.
Well, it's hard to add a lot to that. I think looking back, at least historically, really what divided the United States and from which it's never recovered is probably actually the Vietnam experience and the Vietnam War. And that I think really broke sort of trust in expertise, trust in the elite, trust in the government's ability to do things competently. And I think we've never really seen a full recovery from that. You saw in the graph kind of the brief time in the immediate post 9/11 period, but it very quickly kind of reverted to the mean that we've seen since the 1970s. So in my opinion, that's at the root cause, and we've never really healed those divisions that emerged. It's then produced, it was political divisions, produced cultural and other divisions, and we're seeing all of that continue to play out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We're heading towards the end, and then here we have a last question, which is more about East Central Europe and associated authoritarian practices in these countries. We're thinking of Hungary and Poland. And the question is, do you think that the initial post-Cold War optimism regarding the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe was well-founded? Would you say that there exists perhaps in this region an ingrained historical element of authoritarianism that cannot be overcome? And should we consider recent events in the region as a return to the old Cold War era ways? Or are there real opportunities to foster stable democracy in East Central Europe? Perhaps we can...
No, go
first?
Go
yes?
Okay.
Well, you have a lot of experience in
Well, I think, first of all, we should not paint cultures, societies with such a broad brush like that and make those kinds of generalizations. I think we really won't get very far with that. Certainly there was a great hope and expectation in the immediate post-Cold War period. We have to remember that there were also then serious economic difficulties that I think were underestimated the effect of these, and I think that's particularly the case with Russia, incidentally, a country that I've spent a lot of time working on in terms of how much that discredited sort of the liberal democratic model there. But at least in the eastern part of the European Union, I think that these are probably, we're going to see ebbs and flows in this, and of course no country is immune to populism, and we're seeing it in Eastern Europe, we're seeing it in Western Europe, it's afoot in France, as we've seen recently, it's here in Belgium, it's certainly in the United States. So I don't think anybody quite is immune to this challenge in these times.
Indeed.
And I would very much agree. We obviously were too optimistic in the kind of end of history period, which was around about 1994, 95, when we really thought democracy was inexorable, it will just continue. And of course, we knew from the Arab Spring it didn't, and that led to a greater mood of pessimism. So public opinion, I think, and kind of elite opinion changed around 2005, 2006. And since then, everybody recognizes there are real challenges. In Central and Eastern Europe, however, I think there is also a silver lining. So we're always thinking of Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and the rise of authoritarian populist leaders. But most recently, as we've seen in the Czech Republic just 3 days ago, a new centre-right prime minister was appointed. And in Poland and in Hungary, what you can see is there are basically effective moves by the opposition parties because they realise that if they're divided, they fall. If they come together, and in the next election in Hungary, Viktor Orban is likely to have basically a single contender from amongst the different opposition parties. And that's going to change the name of the game, perhaps. Again, he's got a great advantage through the electoral rules, which he introduced in 2010. But I think that if the opposition comes together, then they can be an effective force to challenge the rise of authoritarian populism. We have seen that in some recent elections. Not everything's basically moving in an authoritarian populist direction. And the public is divided. Some people are certainly fearful. They are fearful of cultural change, of immigration, of changes to the things they hold dear, whether it's religion or marriage or the family, or ideas of sexuality and gender, or ideas of nationalism. People are worried. So there's a genuine cause for concern. But on the other hand, we can't rule out the progressive forces, the democratic forces, the liberal forces haven't gone away. They're simply there. They need to find effective strategies to counter through elections in particular, a way to really get back into power. And one can see that everything's not going in one direction, of course. So different countries will progress in different ways. And we'll have to see how Central and Eastern Europe do it. And in the next few elections that I'm going to be observing, Bulgaria is another important case in point, Turkey and so on.
There's still several questions that are raised, but I think we have to conclude with an extremely nice but also problematic question. The question here is, I was wondering if the guest speakers believe that the public should have open access to information, or if there are some situations where the government should do more gatekeeping, which is a nice link between trust, politics, and information. I give you the floor, please.
Sure. I mean, I think one only needs to look at the the example of Wikileaks, for example, to see this. And that was, on the one hand, a group of people saying, well, everything that's done, and for example, in diplomacy and international relations, it should be made public. We should shine the light of day on it. And it's sort of what underlies it is an assumption that anything that is kept confidential because it therefore must be nefarious and it wouldn't withstand scrutiny. Of course, that's not true, right? In fact, I think the more that we negotiate with one another in public and in the media, of course, the less likely we are to be able to succeed. And that's part of what we have now going on in politics, where politicians are less likely to spend time in a parliamentary chamber actually debating something and more apt to be out there either for their social media feed or the cameras and sort of grandstanding and posturing. But certainly in diplomatic relations, we must be able to have confidential conversations and to keep those confidential, because that's actually how we find solutions. You won't find solutions to major problems by negotiating in public.
So here on the very last point, I might slightly disagree with Mr. Berliner in the sense that the book I've written is called In Praise of Skepticism, and skepticism requires information, which requires transparency. And I know that leaks can damage those who are in power, absolutely. And I know that it can damage diplomatic relations. You only have to look at the Oslo Peace Accord and the way that was developed, very much in private, without having to appeal to the problematic politics of Israel and Palestine and really negotiate in public. But you only are going to get honesty and you're only going to get trust back in government if they're seen as trustworthy and they have full information. And worldwide, of course, that's even more of a problem because more and more governments are pushing back on free press, independent media, journalistic freedom. Journalists are being attacked in Latin America by drug cartels. They're being imprisoned in Burma on spurious charges. In Saudi Arabia, they're being arrested for, again, a number of other independent voices. So I think we absolutely have to have as much trust, openness as we can. And that's a core value, and it's a core value for America as well. An independent media is the watchdog on government, and we can't, even though there might be some negative consequences on particular cases, we can't push back on that. We have to have that as our core principle.
I would just say that at the end of the day, I think it's, governments, and whether it's diplomatic negotiations or anything else, what we need to find are actually solutions that are acceptable to a broad range of people, that are credible and that people can believe in. And of course, we must have transparency overall, but I think the question was sort of, addressing the issue of, are there specific circumstances where things should be kept confidential?
Like JFK.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for these very insightful and inspirational lectures today. And this is, for us, we're very happy here in the room and also hopefully the audience. This is a wonderful kickoff for our North America Regional Committee. And please keep following us. In the spring, we're sure we'll have an event in which we will meet in person, have the reception, and also have the exchange of projects, exchange of research, and also proofs of mobility between North America and Europe. So thanks a lot. Have a nice continuation of your day, Professor Norris, and the audience, a nice continuation of your day, evening. You will hear from us. We will make sure there's a light editing to this product, and we'll make it available for all of you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.